It is June 21st, 2001. We're interviewing Major General John Fenimore at the Latham headquarters. Good morning.
Good morning.
General, where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in Hartford, Connecticut, but I actually grew up in Albany. Always living near the state capitol and Washington Park, and that was my playground most of my growing up years.
You went to school in Albany?
Went to public school in Albany, and I went to the Milne School, which no longer exists, for junior high and high school, and then it was part of the Albany State Teachers College.
Mm-hmm.
And from there I went to Union in Schenectady.
And you graduated, what was your course of study?
It began as physics, but I didn't have the mathematical background, and after one semester my faculty advisor said that you can go ahead and study physics if you want, but if you want to be able to feed yourself and your family, you might want to make science a hobby and look for a career where you might do a little bit better.
Okay, and you took, you heeded that advice.
I did indeed. I had also wanted to be a pilot since I was probably 6, 7, 8 years old. We lived right under the flight path of Albany Airport for the primary runway, so I watched airplanes flying over my yard, and I just knew that that's what I wanted to do. And when I was probably 8 or 10 years old, I actually used to occasionally on weekends ride my bicycle out to Albany Airport. My parents would let me do that, surprising. Well, it was safe then, and not so many cars on the highway, but I'd come out here and spend the whole day watching airplanes. So when I was at Union and I had the opportunity to join ROTC and sign up for pilot training, that's what I did.
Oh, very good. And you graduated from Union?
Barely, but yes, I did.
I can relate to that. And when did you decide to join the, did you join the Army or the Guard first?
Air Force
Air
first.
Force,
I was in Air Force ROTC, and immediately, since I passed the test for pilot training, immediately after graduation, I went down to Moody Air Force Base and began 13 months of pilot training, and then spent 5 years in the Air Force.
Now this, you began when,
63.
63.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the Air Force like in 1963?
Not that much unlike what it is today. Mm-hmm. Not as much overseas travel for the average Air Force officer, because at that time during the Cold War, our forces were in place overseas, ready to meet the Russians if they were to attack. So there wasn't quite as much temporary duty overseas, except for the flyers of transport and tanker aircraft. But it wasn't that unlike what it is today. Some of the social customs were different. I mean, you just went to the officers' club, to the stag bar almost every day after work for a couple of drinks, and on Fridays you went there after work for more than a couple of drinks, and they had huge parties at stag bars, and people had a lot to drink, and that was just the way it was then. Today that's very different.
When did that begin to change?
It began to change after I left the Air Force. From 63 to 68 when I was in, it was that way, but soon after that it started changing.
Now, so you were in the Air Force as the Vietnam War began to
Yes.
grow.
Mm-hmm.
What was the perception of the, what was your perception of the war as it began to evolve?
Well, we knew the war was coming in pilot training, and this was the summer of 63, and which was almost 2 years out. We knew it was coming because it was common at that time for anywhere from a third to half of a pilot training class to wash out. And my class, which began in July, the middle of July, suffered that level of attrition. But I would say we had lost at least a third just by September, maybe more than that. And then a team from the Pentagon came through and visited the base one day and spent a day with the base commander. And from that day on, no one failed. They didn't wash anyone out. And the word trickled down to us that something big was coming, and it was going to be a year or two away, and we were going to need a lot of pilots. The other sign was that my class, 65A, it was even though it started in 63, my class and the class behind it, our aircraft assignments were the usual mix of bombers and transports and fighters and helicopters. But beginning with a class that started in September of that same year, everybody got fighters. Another clue that something was coming. So we didn't know what it was. We had no idea what was going to happen. But it didn't take us that long to find out. And in, when was it? 1965. We got sent over. I was flying C-130s then, tactical airlift mission, and I was based at Langley. And we went to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, and we were there for most of the summer. And then we came back to Langley with no idea that we'd be going over there for any extended period. And by October, we were on our way back for a year. So we knew it was coming. We weren't entirely sure why we were doing this, but when you're 20-some years old and flying is exciting, and the more adventure you can find, the better, you're less likely to question why we're doing it. It's just a big adventure coming up, and that's how it looked before we actually got over there.
Now you were flying transports.
Flying C-130s.
Is
yes.
Is that something you wanted to do?
It was.
Okay.
Most people that went to pilot training when I did wanted to be fighter pilots, and it was assumed by everyone, even in the pilot training bases, that that's what any reasonable person would want. But I didn't want to fly fighters, and the reason I didn't was that every time you land in a fighter, you're probably the same place you were when you took off. And what I wanted to do was fly all over the world, and that was part of the allure of flying for me when I was young growing up, was wanting to travel all over the world. My father had been in the even though he was an accountant, he had been in the Merchant Marine as a younger man and enlisted in the Navy for World War II shortly after I was born. And hearing his stories made me want to travel around the world like he did. So I wanted a transport. I didn't want a bomber either, because they always come back to the same base. So I wanted a transport, and I didn't want one of the biggest transports because they flew over all the good places and just landed at the big airports. I wanted an Air Force version of a tramp steamer that would stop in every port, and that's what the C-130 was then, and still is. So that's why I chose the 130.
So you were in the Philippines in '65?
Yes. It was our base from which we did all our Vietnam flying, although we really weren't. We were there based in name more than in reality. Although it was denied by the Air Force, we think the reason we were sent to the Philippines was to make us more accessible later on. And what I mean by that is that at that time you had to have 15 consecutive days in Vietnam to get credit for a Vietnam tour. We would fly into Vietnam, spend 14 days at whatever base we were located, which we were at 3 or 4 locations around the country. Come back for a day, maybe 2, go back for another 14. So there we were, having spent virtually an entire year minus a dozen days or so in Vietnam, but with no credit for a Vietnam tour. Now, I was one of the lucky ones who was assigned to an air wing in the United States, the continental United States, after. But there were others I knew in my organization who went from that assignment directly to a tour in Vietnam, and the Air Force was able to do it because they had no Vietnam tour on their records. Needless to say, some of us were pretty unhappy about that, and that drove many of us to feel the system wasn't quite as fair as one would hope it would be, and I think a lot of us who had intended to make the Air Force a career, and I would count myself in that group, after that experience thought, well, maybe there are other possibilities.
What, you're flying materiel into Vietnam?
No, mostly intra-theater.
Oh.
The big airplanes and the ships would bring the material into Vietnam, into the major ports, Saigon, Cam Ranh Bay, Da Nang, or Nha Trang. And then we would fly it into the field because the C-130 could land on short dirt runways. And it was the only big airplane that could. So most of our work was flying the Army and Army equipment and ammunition into very forward battle locations. And then when they were, we would fly back there to fly more ammunition in, and we would fly their dead and wounded out. And sometimes, if it was a major battle, they would load us up with as many wounded soldiers as we could put in the airplane, and we would fly them directly to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, which was about 3 hours away, which really saved a lot of people because there were many, many soldiers who were in a bed in a hospital in the Philippines 4 hours after having been shot. So that system worked pretty well. But we did a lot of that, and we flew into airports in the middle of areas where our people were under siege by the enemy, and it made for interesting arrivals and departures flying over enemy positions. But
well, that's a big target, the C-130.
it's a big, slow-moving target when it's landing and just taking off. So, yes, you take a lot of enemy fire.
Well,
But fortunately, the airplane is designed to take a lot of enemy fire, and it did. And it was not uncommon to come back with a lot of holes in the airplane that weren't there when you took off. And I guess the biggest hole we ever got in the airplane was big enough that just to say we had done it, the whole crew exited the airplane through a hole that wasn't there and was not put there by Lockheed.
Boys will be boys.
Yes.
Was there a high attrition rate to aircraft, C-130s?
Generally speaking, no. We didn't expect there would be any attrition rate at all, since we were theoretically we weren't fighter pilots. And although our attrition rates were lower, quite a bit lower than some of the fighter units, still, we got there on Thanksgiving and living in 8-man tents, and there were 5 of us left alive still by Christmas. So that made you acutely aware that there was a real threat there. There were people trying to hurt you.
What were living conditions like in the field?
Well, it almost didn't matter because you weren't flying and getting shot at, so that made it really fine. We lived in tents. We were well fed. When we traveled to many of the Air Force bases, we had air-conditioned facilities to eat in. Our quarters were not air-conditioned. In fact, they built some air-conditioned quarters. They were building them when we were there. We were the first transport unit to be PCS'd to the Southeast Asia, at least in the 130 world. And they began building a BOQ and aircrew quarters for officer and enlisted, where we were based. And about 3 months before we left, they opened it up, and we refused to move in And we did because we had acclimatized ourselves to the heat, and we didn't want to go back and forth into air conditioning. So we just simply wouldn't move in, stayed in our tents, and then the new people that came did move in and were grateful for the air-conditioned quarters.
Now you did, how many tours of duty in Vietnam?
Well, I was there for 2 or 3 months in the summer, I think 2.5 months in the summer of '65, and I went over in the beginning of November of '65, that same year, and spent 1 year there. And then afterwards, when I was flying C-130s for the Airlift Command, I'd make 1 or 2 trips a month into Vietnam, flying from the United States to Vietnam to drop off cargo at one of the main airports usually, and then back to the United States. So for my entire Air Force career, after pilot training, with the exception of I flew in that conflict. The only other conflict I was part of was that brief one in Dominican Republic.
Mm-hmm. Now you decided to leave the Air Force in
1968, and one of the things I had always wanted to do was to be an airline pilot. So I interviewed and was hired. I liked overseas flying, and most of all I wanted to fly with an airline that would give me a long and stable career. So I chose the most prestigious and most stable, secure airline that existed. I don't know if you remember Pan American World Airways. I can't remember the year they went belly up, but that was long after I went to work for them. But about 1.5 years after I went to work for them, which was the summer of '68, they bought this new airplane called a 747. And that airplane carried about twice as many people as the 707s I flew, with the same number of pilots. So someone with even a rudimentary mathematical background could figure out that you only need half as many pilots, and that's what happened. So a lot of us got laid off when that airplane came into service in January of 1970. And of course, you get rehired based on your not your Social Security, your seniority number. And I was recalled 18 or 19 years later. And by then I had a pretty good job with the Air National Guard, and I didn't think going back to Pan Am would be a really good idea. And that proved to be as good a decision as the previous one was a bad decision, because a year or two later they went under.
Mm-hmm. Now, after you left the Air Force, did you stay in the reserves at all?
Yes. Yes, I've actually never left the Air Force. I immediately joined the Air National Guard unit, one in eastern Pennsylvania, Willow Grove, that had C-97s, and was with them for the better part of a year, and was about to go off to 97 school when I got laid off and by Pan American. And about the same time, a slot opened up in a C-141 Reserve Associate unit at McGuire Air Force Base, where I had been stationed, and I lived near in a private home near McGuire Air Force Base. So I joined that unit, went off to 141 school, and flew as a reservist. While I was going to graduate school, I'd always wanted to be a teacher, and I thought, well, that was one of the things I wanted to do. I thought, well, here's an opportunity. They had a program 1.5 years long where you got a master's degree and a teaching certificate, so I entered that program, and about 2/3 of the way through it, there were massive teacher layoffs in the metropolitan New York, New Jersey area, and suddenly 2 or 3 jobs that I had been tentatively offered to teach geography at community colleges and one high school job, suddenly there were very experienced teachers and PhDs standing in line for those jobs, and I was no longer competitive. But something always opens up, and sure enough, C-130, or the C-97 unit at the 109th in Scotia was converting to C-130s, and they didn't know anybody who knew how to fly C-130s. They were looking for an instructor pilot. So I heard about it and went up to visit them, and they offered me a job as a temporary for 1 year. So I took that, and consequently didn't finish the master's program, but was back flying Air Force airplanes again full-time, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I've been in the Guard full-time ever since.
What was the Guard like back then?
Fewer pressures than there are today, because you were only training. You had a lot less real-world missions to fly, and the ones you did were almost all in the continental United States. So you could, as a guardsman, you could put in 2 weeks a year and 1 weekend a month, and that was quite sufficient, which of course, as you know, it isn't today. But that was a very enjoyable experience, and I did that for 2 or 3 years, and then applied for and was accepted at the Air Guard headquarters to be their operations officer. And I was the ops officer at the Air Guard headquarters from 73 to 76.
That's down in Newburgh?
Well, actually, it was at the Westchester County Airport in White Plains then. The unit moved a little later.
Okay.
And in January of 76, I think it was the 2nd of January, I was the only one in the office. We had a brand new Adjutant General, Vito Castellano. You may have heard the name. And I didn't know him, and I don't think he knew me, but I guess there were some scores to settle. And one day, well, on that day, the day after I think New Year's, I don't know why I remember this. Well, being fired is never really, I mean, that sticks in your mind, sort of like Air Force layoffs, but, I mean, excuse me, airline layoffs. But I showed up for work, one of 2 or 3 people did, and a general from Albany was sent down, and he just came in the office and said, "Hi, Happy New Year." He said, "I need to tell you something," and I said, "What's that, sir?" And he said, "Well, the state no longer requires your services. Do you have any questions?" And
rather elegant.
And I said, "Well, yes. How much time do I have?" And he said, "Well, yeah, we might give you a month," which is about what they gave me. So that was the end of that job. And I found a job back at the 109th as the intelligence officer, dramatic reduction in pay, but I didn't mind. I was just grateful to have the work. And I did that for about a year, and then a flying opportunity opened up at the 105th, which was at the Westchester County Airport. I hadn't moved my family, so that worked out very well for me, and I went back to the 105th, stayed with that unit, became the air commander, was with the unit when we moved it to Stewart. And the reason we moved it to Stewart was we knew that the O2, which we had then, was not going to be the inventory forever, just for another few years at best. And the Westchester County Airport had very short runway, and it had been adequate for the propeller aircraft that had been there before, but it couldn't take any jet aircraft, and not any Air Force jet aircraft. So we knew we had to leave to survive. We had been using Stewart, which was pretty much an abandoned airport at the time, for training because there wasn't anybody there. It had been an Air Force base. The Air Force moved out, and then when Rockefeller was governor, he decided that New York City needed a 4th major jet port, and he, or people on his staff making a recommendation to him, decided that Stewart should be that airport. So they lengthened the runway from 9 to about 12,000 feet, made other large improvements, made it strong enough to take the weight of a 747, and That, by the way, in area is the second largest airport in the United States, second only to Dallas-Fort Worth. So there was plenty of area to expand. But they made the runways just first class. It was great. And they were starting to work on a high-speed train system between New York City and Newburgh, and everything was going pretty well. And then suddenly Rockefeller became the vice president. And when he left, that was the end of that project. So here you had one of the best airports in the United States that nobody was using. The reason they weren't using it was it had no approach control radar. That left when the Air Force left. And without approach control radar, if it's instrument flying conditions, you can sit on the ground at the end of the runway for 45 minutes waiting for a takeoff clearance. And landing can be delayed considerably too. And because of that, no commercial airline would even consider flying out of there, and nor would a corporate flight department, because when the president wants to leave, he wants to leave now, not sometime in the next hour or so. So the airport was unused. It was owned by, I think it was the Metropolitan Transit Authority that owned it. I'm not sure about that, but it was owned by one of those authorities that also owned another airport on Long Island. I'm not sure what else. But what we did, and I say we, the leader of this was Paul Weaver, who's now director of the Air National Guard in Washington, but who was a senior officer in the state headquarters at the time. He was able to get some legislation passed that transferred ownership of those two airports to the state of New York. And as part of that arrangement, we were given a parcel of land at a very inexpensive lease on Stewart Airport, which was important because I think the lease was 50-year with a 50-year renewable option. And with that long a lease, we knew the Air Force would be willing to invest in that property. And for a while, a number of airplanes were considered, but eventually the Air Force decided on the C-5 for us, and we then spent $155 million building the biggest reserve facility ever built in the United States. And we made it a joint, we decided to make it a joint facility, which would make it easier to get the money in Congress. And the Marines were looking for a home for tankers in the Northeast, C-130 tankers. So we partnered with the Marines to build both units on the same base, and that worked very well.
That brought the radar, you're able to...
And it's a long way to get around to the radar again, but our presence at Stewart caused the FAA to, I don't know if they had to put it in, but whatever, I don't know what the decision-making process was, but it allowed, our presence there allowed the people who wanted radar in, our representatives on the Hill in Washington, to put pressure on the FAA, and now the FAA had an excuse to put it in there. Maybe that's the way I should have put it in the first place. Our representatives on the Hill have been trying to get radar in there for quite a while, but the FAA rightly could say, why should we do that? There's nobody there that needs it. Once we were there and the Marines were there, then the FAA could say, okay, well, there is a reason for it, so if you give us the money, we'll put it in. The minute the radar came, American Airlines came, and then other airlines and corporate flight departments. So it was that radar made possible by our being there that got the development of Stewart Airport going, for better or worse. So.
What, in your tenure when you were in the Air National Guard down in Stewart and Westchester, what was the relationship between the Air National Guard and the regular Air Force?
The same as it's been throughout my entire experience, very close.
Why? There appears to be a difference between the relationship between the Air National Guard and the Air Force, and the Army National Guard and the Army.
Well, in this case, appearance is reality, and there's an enormous difference. I don't know what the genesis of the Army problem is, but I do know that the relationship between the active Army and the Army National Guard is not good. And that's almost making it look better than it really is to say that. I don't understand why, but having been in the Air Force and experienced the close cooperative climate that we have, I am absolutely mystified at how the Army allows that relationship to continue. In the Air Force, let me say in the Air National Guard, we've always prided ourselves, as long as I've been in it, since 1969, 68, we've always prided ourselves on being a mirror image of the Air Force. However the Air Force does something, that's the way we want to do it. We don't try and be different, we try and be just like them, except for those areas where we feel we can be better than they are. And one would be, and they would agree, any active Air Force person who understands the Guard would agree with this, in aircraft maintenance in particular, we are much better than the Air Force simply because their average mechanic is probably in his or her 20s. And our average mechanic used to have about a 10-year experience advantage over the active duty counterpart. Today, it's actually a little over 10 years. So we do a better job maintaining airplanes, not because our people are any more capable, but because they have so much more experience. So that would be one major difference, but that's just a difference in experience. But we've always seen eye to eye with the Air Force, and you know, there have been some family fights about resources, but minimal fights, nothing at all compared with the Army. And in the end, even though we don't always have the most modern equipment at every base, that's okay, because even if it's not the most modern equipment, it's still combat capable. And the Air Force has been very good about resourcing us adequately. The Air Force and the Army seem to have two different approaches to force structure and readiness. In the Air Force view, if they can't have a fully combat-ready unit ready to go to war tomorrow, they would rather not have the unit. The Army is far more reluctant to give up flags, as they would call it. Maybe it's a heritage thing, I don't know what it is, but they will have units out there, and they have countless units in our state that really are minimally combat ready, and they're given just enough money so they can survive. They're not healthy, but they're alive. And the Army would rather do that than shut down units. And you know, I don't know if that's a conscious plan, but that's the effect. But the Air Force doesn't like that. The unit can go to war tomorrow, or we don't want it. It's that simple. And we will resource the unit, whether it's in the active Air Force or the reserves or the National Guard. We will resource it so it can go to war tomorrow if it has to.
And this is a long-standing policy, tradition, what have you?
That's been true in the Air National Guard as long as I've been in it, since the late 60s. Mm-hmm. Nothing has changed. It's always been a good relationship. Does
the Air Force take advantage of the, like you mentioned that you have this pool of mechanics, which is probably better than regular Air Force. Does the Air Force take advantage of that asset at all?
Not that much, because it isn't practical for them to. The only way they're able to take advantage of it would be, and the 105th would be a good example. The 105th is a unit that doesn't go anywhere in wartime. The planes do, but the mechanics don't. The base stays there. That's their wartime location. That's true of any strategic airlift unit in the Air Force. And the Air Force, particularly during the Gulf War and other periods where the C-5s have been in great demand, when they've had trouble with some of their C-5s, they've sent them to Stewart for repairs. because Stewart does have the most modern C-5 repair facility in the country, and that combined with their highly experienced workforce, now that they have many mechanics who have been working on the C-5 since the early 80s. And with that experience base, the Air Force knows it can send an airplane to Stewart, and it's going to leave Stewart in better shape than it was when it landed.
And they have no problem with that?
No, no.
Institutionally?
No, they don't, and we don't, because they resource us adequately to do that.
Now, how did you become Adjutant General?
Well, by the time anybody sees this, I won't be in the job anymore, so I did not apply for the job. I remember in the late winter of '95, when the current administration took office, General Hall was relieved, which is customary because the Adjutant General does not serve in the state and most states a tour of duty of a certain number of years. There are a few states where the Adjutant Generals serve a 3 or 4 year tour of duty, and if there's a new administration of the same or different party, it doesn't matter. You finish your tour of duty and then they replace you with somebody if they choose to at the end. But almost all states, and New York is one of them, the Adjutant General serves at the pleasure of the governor. And that's really good. I think it's a good system, and I hope it never changes, because if the Adjutant General isn't getting along with the administration, it hurts the organization. And if that relationship isn't really good, hopefully the Adjutant General would have enough responsibility to leave on his own, and if he doesn't, he ought to be fired, because it hurts the agency. But in this state, you serve at the pleasure, so whenever there's a change of administration, particularly of a political party, but even within a political party normally, you get a new Adjutant General. There were a number of people, and I won't give you the names, but there were many people that applied for the Adjutant General job shortly after the election. And there were some people who were wondering why, some people in the administration who were wondering why these people would apply for the job when it didn't exist yet. We still had an Adjutant General. I didn't, for the simple reason that the job hadn't been advertised. Okay, we've just changed tapes, and
Now we're
trying to remember exactly where I was in that thought process, but there were people that had been applying for the job. I did not. In the early spring, I was home having dinner, and my pager went off. And I looked at the number, and I didn't recognize it, and I wasn't going to call it, and then, well, I was finished dinner, so I thought, well, it's a local number, so I'll go ahead and give a call. And I dialed the number, and someone picked up the phone and said, "Executive Chamber." And I said, "Oh, sorry, I must have dialed the wrong number." He said, "Wait, who are you?" So I told him what my name was. He said, "Oh, no." And then he identified himself and said, "You're aware that General Hall has recently been relieved of command by the governor?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, we're going to be searching for a new Adjutant General, as you can imagine. Would you be willing to serve as the interim during this search process?" So I said, "Yes, I'll be happy to help you out and do that." So he said, "Okay, thanks. Just keep this conversation to yourself. Don't call us, we'll call you." And about a month later, they called me up again and said, "We would like you to start on the 19th of May, and we'll tell you when you can tell people." And so I started on the 19th of May as the interim Adjutant General, and served in that capacity until mid-July, when, after a meeting downtown, they said, we've decided we're going to let you continue to run the agency. So at that point I became the Adjutant General, and that's how I got the job. What the decision process was, I can't tell you because I wasn't part of that. I was not actually interviewed. Well, I guess you could call that 2-month period an interviewer and an on-the-job trial. But that's in essence how it worked. And then shortly thereafter, I got a call from the appointments office, and they said, well, you need Senate confirmation, not to get the job in this case, but to be promoted to Major General in the state. And they said, we can't find your application. And I said, well, I never applied. And they said, well, you got to have an application. So I said, fine, fax me one, I'll fill it out, which I did, and that's how I got the job.
Now, as you're coming in as the interim Adjutant General, what was your view of the agency? You'd been mainly Air National Guard. That'd been your primary experience.
I'd been totally Air National Guard, but and fortunately for us in the National Guard, at least this is how we viewed it then, because of the very decentralized nature of our command structure. And by that I mean it's virtually all of your leadership is at the 5 flying bases, and very little of it is here in this building. And there are close to 400 people that work in the DMNNA headquarters full-time, and of those about 12 are Air National Guard. And the reason is the almost totally decentralized nature of our operation. And the advantage of that is the system leaves you alone, and that we appreciated that.
So now you're the system.
And I think I think it still works pretty well. And that's not a criticism of the Army system at all, because you have so many armories around the state that you can't do what air bases do. You can't have finance and personnel and all those services at every armory. You just can't do it. So the Army operates the only way it can, and the air bases operate the way they do. But so my experience was one of an outsider looking in terms of the Army. However, I was very aware, because it was common knowledge, that back in those days, the New York Army National Guard in strength and recruiting and retention was by all objective measures the worst in the nation. And they weren't doing really well in the readiness front either, probably because of the first thing. We had gone through a period of more than a decade where we were losing an average of 1,000 soldiers a year. The strength of the Army Guard, if you remember, was up around, the authorized strength, up around 24,000. We never really had that many, because I don't think we ever had over 20, but I don't know, and I'm not an expert on that, but that's just what I remember hearing at the time. But at any rate, people weren't happy for whatever reason. I wasn't in the Army Guard at the time, so I can't be critical about anything really, since I don't have any information base to criticize. But for whatever reason, they were getting out at the rate of about 1,000 a year, and the National Guard Bureau was taking force structure away from the state, but we were losing people faster than the Guard Bureau could take units away. We in the Bureau were in a race to the bottom, and we were winning, and it was just a very bad situation. And I knew that was probably the most critical problem that needed to be addressed. And on the first day, I had a meeting with the Army staff, and I mentioned that we were occupying this very visible position of last. And I was looking for some comments as to why that might be. And the collective answer was, well, this is a Northeast problem, and there's not a whole lot we can do about it. And I thought, well, I knew it was a Northeast problem. Northeast was not doing as well as other parts of the country were in recruiting and retention. But I asked them, have you considered doing anything about this? And the answer I got back from one of them was, well, we're thinking that later this year we're going to create a process action team to study the situation and determine whether or not we have a problem. And I thought that was a good first step. But and then I said, well, while you're waiting for that, have you considered? I said, you've got your attrition rate is 28% a year and rising. Have you considered perhaps having a goal some lower number? And they said, yes, we've considered seeing if we could have a goal of 23%. And I said, well, that surprises me because the Guard Bureau standard for the Army Guard is a worst case 18%. I said, why wouldn't you set your goal to at least equal the Guard Bureau's worst acceptable case number? The answer I got back was, and a lot of head nods, you wouldn't ever want to set a goal for yourself you might not achieve. And that taught me a whole lot. Then I really had that was that moment that you really understand why you are where you are. So the next several days, some people changed jobs, and some people left the organization, some went back out to the field, and we brought some experience in from the field, some new ideas. And I had a meeting with the just about all the battalion commanders and other people who reported on readiness ratings, and I explained to them my limitations, which were simply that not having grown up in the Army, I didn't understand how to run an Army unit nearly as well as they did, nor did I understand how to recruit, attract, and retain people as well as they did. But we were in a crisis situation. I had been to the Bureau and they were projecting us down to 6,900 people in the Army Guard. And fortunately, because of having worked with the Bureau on many projects over the years, in my prior job, I had a pretty good rapport with a few of them, and I said, look, give us a year or so to see if we can turn it around before you implement any of those plans. And they said, okay. They were confident, not because they knew how successful I'd be, but it was a change of leadership, and the dynamic changes, and who knows what's going to turn out. So I figured, well, it's worth a chance. So they gave us that time. But I told these people, these commanders, that they had the expertise I didn't. So I was taking a snapshot. It was early June I had that meeting with them, and I said that by about 6 months from today, I said we're going to take another snapshot, and if you've dramatically improved the status of your organization, that will be good, and you can keep your job. That will be your reward. And if you haven't, then if you're an otherwise good person, we'll find a staff job for you. And if we're not impressed in general, it'll be the gold watch in the parade. And I apologized for having to be that direct, but I said, I don't know how to fix this. You do, or at least some of you do. And there are other people out in the field who know how to fix it, and they'll replace some of you if, for those of you that don't know how to fix it. So that was helpful, and of course, the biggest single thing that helped turn it around was getting a tuition bill. But that was, in the beginning, that was the huge issue for us, was just trying to turn around that bleeding, that hemorrhaging of people.
Do you see that as your biggest success to this point?
Probably. One of the biggest. I think, well, let me see, well, of course the tuition bill, that was hugely important in that turnaround. But another thing that we're really happy with is our dramatically increased participation in efforts to help out after natural disasters. We hadn't done that in a very big way in previous years. It's not that we refused to do it. Nope. None of my predecessors would have refused to do that. But I don't see, and could not see any, at the time, any proactive steps taken to insert ourselves. And what we did was we decided that, and by we I mean General Martin and the rest of the leadership team, we collectively decided that it would be a good idea to change the way we've been doing business, which would mean inserting ourselves into a system that wasn't accustomed to using us a whole lot. So we knew there would be some resistance, and there was. But our first real opportunity came with the Long Island fires that were in the late summer, I think, of '95. And we offered to help with engineering equipment and other things, and the offer was politely declined. But we went ahead and positioned our equipment down there anyway, just outside the area of operation, if you want to call it that. And when the fire got worse, and when the local people saw that we had the equipment moving into position, they said, we really would like this. So the State Emergency Management Office relented and asked us to help out, and that really began the whole process. And I think the administration was pleased because we did make a difference in that fire, not just our equipment on the ground, but the helicopters that we used to drop water near houses that were being threatened. And that worked out very well for us and for the people on Long Island.
Was there any internal institutional resistance to that type of posture, as opposed to, you know, we're here just to get ready for a national defensive mission? There
was some, but it was not an overwhelmingly powerful resistance. It was a different way of doing business, and any bureaucracy will resist change, and this did to some extent. But there wasn't a lot of resistance. No, I wouldn't say that was a real problem. The resistance was in the civilian first responder community. Not because they didn't like us, it's just that they weren't accustomed to our being part of the fight. But afterwards, the attitudes at State Emergency Management Office and others changed dramatically, and they welcomed us from that point on. And I think there might have been some fear, having watched what happened in LA riots and some other episodes where the not so much the National Guard, but the active military was present. There was a fear that we're going to come in and we're going to try and take over. And when they realized that that was not our intent, that we were there just to be helpful, we come when we're invited, and when you don't need us or when it's over with, then we leave, and you can have all the credit, we don't care, and we're not going to try and control anything. We will always work in support of the local people who were in charge of the operation. Once they realized that, then the resistance fell apart. The administration was pleased with the agency. I don't think they had a good opinion of this agency prior to our coming. At any rate, they liked that. The next opportunity we had to help in that arena was when we had the blizzards in January of '96, which were some of the biggest blizzards the southern part of the state's ever seen. And we knew we knew a bad storm was coming. We didn't know how bad it would be, but we did decide to activate the state emergency command post in in SEMO. And I remember it was a Sunday, I think, midday, and we had called everybody in, and I just happened to already be there. So I was the only one in this large command center they've got. And I was in one corner of the room, and there was a cleaning woman in the other corner of the room. I could just barely see her. And the phone rang, I could hear it in the distance, and she picked it up, and she talked for a few seconds, and then she turned to me, and she was holding the telephone up, and she shouted across the room, "Hey, General, there's this guy on the phone. He claims he's the governor, and he wants to talk to you." So, fortunately for me, I took the call, and it was. And he said, "I want you to call the county execs of the 6 counties being affected, the mayor of New York, and tell them that the National Guard's going to be there to offer whatever assistance we can offer." He had seen what we did on the fires. He liked that, and so he wanted to start using us. And that was very important, and that made it easier for us in the future, knowing the governor's intent to use the National Guard to help the people in New York. It made it easier for us to respond to prepare for the response before being called. As an example, in the ice storm that happened in, I think it was '98, January of '98, 2 years later, we knew this ice storm was starting. We knew the effect it might have, and about a day into it, we knew the effect it was going to have. We had no requests for help yet because the telephone poles hadn't started falling down, but it was easy to predict that would happen. We knew the size of the area, which was about the size of Vermont, and we knew it would be a huge undertaking to try and get the generators and the teams of people with chainsaws and everything else we needed. And we estimated that it could take up to 4,000 people, which it did. And we actually started mobilizing before the first calls for help came. And it's very expensive to do that because you do that on state active duty. You're using state money. Now, if you get a federal declaration, then you get most of it back. But in the beginning, before you know, you're rolling the dice. And if you don't know what the governor's intent is, you don't start paying 4,000 people every day without knowing whether they're going to like this or not. But the governor made it very clear to us from that January on, and in subsequent things that we did, whether it was the floods or the TW-800 or whatever, the governor's intent was always consistent, and that was, do whatever you can do to help the people of New York, and we'll deal with the paperwork afterwards. So that gave us the confidence to begin this huge mobilization. And we did mobilize 4,000 people, 1,000 vehicles. We had 900 generators. According to the farmers, pretty much saved the dairy herd because there were over 1,700 dairy farms, and most of them are small, and they couldn't afford these 25 to 50 kVA generators that you need to operate the coolers and the milking machines. And I didn't know anything about dairy farming at the time, and I didn't know what mastitis was. But I quickly learned that if you don't milk a cow twice a day, it very quickly gets mastitis. And then if it survives, it will probably never again produce enough milk to make it commercially viable. And you'll have to sell it for meat. So getting the generators to those farms really saved those farms. The first few days we didn't have enough generators for everybody. But we did have enough generators, which we had in the back of the trucks, so that about 5 farms would share one generator, and they could at least milk the cows. They couldn't keep the milk, they had to dump it, but they could at least save their cows. But after a few days, we had enough generators so that 2 farms could share one generator, and let them milk and cool the milk. We were concerned that owners of commercial establishments might feel cheated because they weren't getting power. And I can remember spending one night in a cold Plattsburgh motel with no light and no heat, and saying to the owner, I hope you're not too upset about the fact that we're supplying power to the dairy farms and we haven't given you a generator. And he said, not at all. He said, I understand that. He said, the whole economy up here is dairy, and if the dairy farms go under, so do I. So don't worry about us. We're just happy that you're keeping them alive. But again, getting back to the beginning of it, it was the governor's intent, knowing his intent, his consistent intent, that allowed us to do those kinds of things proactively.
Are there any other initiatives that you feel proud of?
Well, I think one thing that we did in retrospect that was very helpful in an indirect way was decide early on that, contrary to conventional wisdom that says the press is the enemy, we would embrace the press and be as open as we possibly could, which means telling them anything short of classified information that they wanted to know, and try to build a relationship with the press. Not so that we would get favored treatment. They're not going to do that. They can't. But at least we could get a fair hearing. And we did that. And we've done countless editorial boards, and we've gone out of our way to make ourselves accessible to the press. And that's been very good because while they haven't given us any special treatment, and nor would we ask for it, they have reported on the things we've done. They've told our story. And that's been really good because it's helped morale of the units. When the I don't know if you can remember them, but one of the last editorials about the National Guard in the Times-Union prior to '95 was, the title of the editorial was, "It's Time to Retire the Guard." They just felt that it just wasn't sufficiently useful to warrant spending any money on it. If you look at the editorials since that time, you get an entirely different picture. It's the same people. Yes, we're being more proactive in terms of trying to help them, but I think getting our story out was very important. And for those people that made the sacrifices to be out there in that miserable weather, in the ice storm and the floods and the blizzards, to read about what you did the next day makes you feel really good. That's natural. Anybody would feel good about that. And when you feel good about being in your unit and your neighbors know that you were doing this to help them, you're more inclined to stay in that unit. So I think that policy of embracing the press rather than treating them as the enemy really helped us build morale in units and retain people. And the retention rates did go up a whole lot. Another thing that helped was that program we call Guard Help. We saw how much morale improved in units that were participating in response to these natural disasters. So we thought, well, if morale goes up when people are helping, why should we have to wait for another disaster for people to get out and get involved with the community? And we had the first 3 years of the last 6 were just one natural disaster, or we have to wait for a disaster to help the people of the state. So our initiatives group came up with this whole concept of this Guard Help program, where we would do as much of our annual training as we could in support of local communities. And a good example would be engineering units going up to Fort Drum, paving a piece of ground, and then it gets torn up so some other engineering unit can come up and pave it. Why not pave a playground somewhere? I mean, it makes so much sense, but nobody was doing it. We went around. What was different about this program was that we went around from community to community in the state and told them about what our capability, we didn't go in saying, this is what we want to do for you. We said, these are the kind of capabilities we have. Please talk to us about some of the needs that you have. So they would do that, and frequently in that conversation, in that dialogue, we would realize that there's something we could do for them that we had not even thought of. One example of that was the use of helicopters to lift junked vehicles out of places that you couldn't get to very easily. The first place we did that was on Long Island, and in talking to the people down there, they said, sort of after the fact, well, we have this other problem, we're sure you can't, we don't think we want you to do anything about this because we don't want you to make new roads, but what happened in the Pine Barrens was there were roads, dirt roads, people would abandon cars in the Pine Barrens. We sealed off the area and trees grew up and there are no more roads, but the cars are there. It's a decade or two later, they're rusting and they're starting to leak gas and oil into the aquifer from which Long Islanders get all their drinking water. And the local commander of the helicopter unit that was part of this discussion said, well, wait a minute, now I wasn't there during this, but this is how it was related to me. We have to go to Fort Drum every year, and we practice picking up artillery pieces and moving them from one place to another, and the helicopter doesn't know what's on the other end of the cable, so maybe this year we could lift cars out of the Pine Barrens and put them wherever you want them. And that way you don't have to cut new roads in to get them out, which they didn't want to do, fearing more people would leave cars in there. So that's what we did. Instead of picking up concrete weights or artillery pieces, we picked abandoned automobiles out of the Pine Barrens in New Jersey, or in Long Island, and we've done that in some other locations since. We've taken down crack houses, we've removed safety hazards that were in different places, and we've done a lot of this on active duty status. We don't send the communities a bill. We get approval from the National Guard Bureau to do this, because the way we do it, the people who are performing these operations are doing the same thing they would do in combat training. It's just a car instead of a concrete weight. So they get the same quality training, so the Guard Bureau is happy, and the communities are happy, and our people are much happier because they know they're doing something useful. So that's been a really, really good program that I think made a difference in the morale for the Army National Guard.
Any disappointments in your tenure?
Oh, sure, there are always some. I guess if I had to decide or pick something that we had not done as well as we could have, I would say, particularly near the end of the last couple of years, well, the whole period, we were good at doing these entrepreneurial kind of new initiatives, but we were not as good running the day-to-day operations of the organization, watching the finances and those kinds of things. What happened to us, or the kind of mode we were in, was that of a new company that's just starting up. And when companies start up, they go through first an entrepreneurial phase, where all kinds of new initiatives and crusades are in progress, and that's good, and that builds the company. But at some point, you have to start internally taking care of business, those not as exciting day-to-day drab details. And what usually happens in the private sector is one of two things. The people who are leading the company through its entrepreneurial phase keep leading it and keep that entrepreneurial mindset, and eventually the company sort of implodes from within, because some important things that need to be housekeeping things that need to be taken care of aren't being done as well as they could be, because the leadership isn't watching them as carefully as it could. And that's one reason so many companies fail, because they keep in that entrepreneurial crusading kind of mode, and you can't do that forever. the companies that succeed are companies that after that entrepreneurial phase is over with, now they bring in some senior leaders who are good at the sustainment kind of management. And I'm just guessing, but maybe 2 years ago, we were getting to a place, maybe it was only a year ago, but we've been through that entrepreneurial phase, and we've come to realize recently, fortunately before damage is done, but that we need some new thinking. We need some people in some senior positions in this company that can handle the sustainment phase. Rumsfeld right now is going through a similar process with DOD. Not that they were in an entrepreneurial phase, but they have been very much in the press for not being able to handle their finances too well. And he said it's time that we bring some private sector rigor and discipline into the accounting and finance system in DOD. We're going to call it DOD Inc. Well, that's good. It really is, because billions get sort of lost in the shuffle and they can't tell you exactly where it went. And that's the truth, not because the people are incompetent, but the system isn't there to allow them to track it all. I don't think we're as bad as DOD, but certainly some improvement can take place there and in a few other areas. So what we've done recently is some reorganizing. We've got some new people. We got somebody new in running our state finance. The federal finance piece was always in pretty good shape because that is so structured. You can't deviate much from what you're supposed to be doing. You don't have the option. The state side is less structured. So we've got some new people and some new procedures in place now. We're going to try and tighten up our day-to-day management of the details, and we could have done that better all along. That's one of the things that we were probably worst at, but we're finally dealing with that, and hopefully the person that replaces me will have more of that sustainment mindset, because that's what this organization needs right now. The big initiatives have happened, and now we need some stability in the organization, and that will be useful. So I think I'm confident that my successor and the team that has partly already been put in place will deal with that, which will make the agency a lot more solid. It will give it better credibility with the state budget people and the administration and the following administrations someday. So that's probably the biggest disappointment, that I couldn't get a better balance during those 6 years. It was more entrepreneurial and not enough of the sustainment.
How do you find operating in a political environment? Because in the Air National Guard, I don't think it was quite as political.
Well, it wasn't political at all.
Right. Now this is a different milieu.
It is, because in this job you're the interface between the military and the political worlds. And no cultures could be more different, because the military, and that's not a criticism of either one, the military by design is a highly structured, predictable environment. The political arena is neither. Not because they couldn't do it, but that's just the nature of the world they're in. Their world, the external world for these people, changes from day to day, and they have to cope with that. They have to cope with all kinds of pressures. But that's what happens in a democracy. You have pressures from all these constituencies, and your act as a leader in the political world is to balance all these pressures and somehow get things done. And I have come through this experience having gained an immense respect for the people who are able to pull it off. These are really bright people. Frequently in the military, the conventional wisdom is, these people aren't too sharp. You know, political hack is an expression that comes up a lot. Well, that's not the case. These are extremely bright people who are doing something, achieving something that very few military people could do. So, and I appreciate that they're doing that for us. I especially appreciate that this particular administration's paid more attention to this agency. It isn't the benign neglect that we've had in years past. And I can say that having served in an appointed capacity for 4 governors, 2 Republican and 2 Democrat. So this is not a political statement. But this particular governor has taken a real interest in the agency, and so has his administration. We wouldn't have a history program, quite frankly, if it weren't for initiatives of some of the people in state operations. Not because we don't like it, but it wouldn't have occurred to us. And like any other bureaucracy, our initial reaction was, "Why? This isn't part of combat readiness. Why are we spending money and energy on this?" That was a cultural thing we had to get through in this organization, and to an extent I even include myself in that. But in retrospect, I think that's one of the best things we've done. I can't take any credit for it, but it's one of the best things that's happened in this organization, and really all the credit goes to state operations. But they're remarkable that they can achieve what they do, and I have been comfortable in this environment principally because I don't try and understand their world. I don't try and game them. I accept their choices as politically wise and expedient, and not expedient in the bad sense, but in the sense that something is necessary to do. And I've stayed out of state politics. I've just run the agency and let them make the political decisions because that's what they're good at and I'm not. And I don't play poker because I'm not good at playing poker, and I don't play in the political arena because that's not where my expertise lies. And they've done a very good job, in my opinion.
Well, thank you very much, General. This has been a great interview.
Well, thank you
We
for the
appreciate it.
opportunity.
Well, thank you.